Hello and welcome to the Acclaim It Knowledge Network webinar series. Today's webinar is COVID-19, Managing Talent Risks Through Smart Compliance Strategies. I'm Bill Skoranek, Senior Director of Marketing, and today Jen Spicher and Rob Cruz with TalentWave will put the new world of COVID-19 and the gig economy into perspective, giving practical advice on how to obtain the talent you need without inadvertently assuming undue risk. Jen Spicher is Executive Vice President of Sales and Solutions and has over 20 years of experience in the workforce solutions industry and delivers strategy and thought leadership in a variety of solutions. Rob Cruz is Vice President of Compliance and Senior Legal Counsel and a counselor and a problem solver who is willing to challenge accepted norms and investigate the compliance landscape with fresh ideas and the newest data. After the presentation, we'll open up the webinar for questions and answers. You can ask a question at any time by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of the webinar window, and we'll try to get to every question in the allotted time. We'll also be providing a recorded version of this webinar along with the downloadable version of the presentation on our website, and an email will be sent to you with the link to access it. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Jen and Rob.
Great. Thanks, Bill. Thanks so much, and thank you to the Acclaim It team for having us here today. Excited to be here. So first off, again, Jen Spicher, and I'm just going to run through quickly the agenda. We're going to talk just a little bit about TalentWave and who we are and what we do. The talent trends that we're seeing and the challenges in the market, particularly coming out of this pandemic. Next, we're going to chat a little bit about the changing employment landscape and all the legislation that's coming out around independent contractors and how you can how you should be, engaging them in the future. And then lastly, managing your risk and mitigating your risk against this population and really preparing for the new norm. So quickly, TalentWave is a specialist in the independent contractor compliance field. We are an IC compliance and payrolling company. That is all we do, and we've been doing it now for 23 years. So we are one of the most experienced companies that does this in the industry. Primarily service Fortune 2000 clients, and we have done over 60,000 evaluations in our 23-year history. We have been through 12, both state and federal audits, and none of our clients or us have ever had to pay a fine or had any of our classifications overturned. So truly a specialist in this industry. So some current talent trends and challenges. First off, until the COVID pandemic started, the gig economy was showing absolutely no signs of slowing down. Over 53 million workers in the US were working either gig jobs or side jobs. That's 1 in 3 Americans who performed this freelance work, and it was growing in 19. Coming out of this pandemic, as many of you know and have been forced to work at home, everybody has been virtual. And so we only see this particular group growing coming out of this pandemic. That said,
I would add to that as well, Jen, just to jump in, that study came out just last week as well, that citing post-pandemic, the expanded use of contingent workers is one of the trends you could expect to see. So looking backwards to look forward, we still expect that growth to continue.
Yeah, absolutely. And some of the historical things that we've seen as an organization coming out of 9/11, we saw a spike in the use of independent contractors and the amount of independent contractors that wanted to become workers, I should say, that wanted to be ICs. We saw it again at the end of the Great Recession, the 08-09 kind of Great Recession. We saw another large spike in independent contractors. And coming out of COVID, when basically every person in the United States was forced to work virtually, we anticipate that the number of folks wanting to be ICs or even just wanting to remain working at home is going to be very large. Saw a study last week that said 48% of employees will likely still remain remote or at least partly remote after COVID-19. So the number of ICs and the number of gig workers hitting the marketplace isn't going to. Certainly, we've seen numbers on gig economy companies like Upwork and Fiverr. Upwork's growth in Q1 year over year was 22%. Fiverr's was 44%. And then, of course, companies like Citrix, who of course own GoToMeeting, who are work from home, virtual operationalized companies that give you the opportunity to connect remotely with your teams across the globe. are showing tremendous growth in this marketplace.
Right. So what that's showing as well is that you've got the food chain where the businesses who are getting workers through Upwork and Fiverr have already begun that pivot. Certainly, Jen, Q2 numbers could look a little different, but we don't expect that the trend of the supplying companies to companies pivoting towards contingents versus full-time employees to really subside.
Yeah, and I spoke to 3 clients last week that shared with me, which I thought was very, very compelling, that their entire rest of 20 and 2021 hiring strategy is 100% contingent because they just don't know what's going to happen with COVID. Is it going to come back in the fall? Are they going to have to go back and be virtual? What does their marketplace look like in the future? And so they aren't taking any chances. These 3 particular clients have just come out and said, we're going to go all contingent workers. So all of this growth in the gig economy, right? Then couple that with the many changes that are happening in the employment landscape. And Rob, I'm going to turn it over to you as our legal expert on the call today.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. So, as we're looking at trends, to look backwards, to look forward, what it will look like post-pandemic, there's been some talk about whether or not worker misclassification, enforcement of worker misclassification will be, necessarily set aside as just something that is less important in today's, environment. And, again, worker misclassification, that just focuses on, are you legally classifying your worker as an independent contractor or an employee? As you know, we've only got the 2 regimes, independent contractor or employee, under U.S. law. So they either are one or they're not the other. If they are a misclassified employee and you're paying them as an IC, your business is at risk for back penalties, fines, lawsuits, et cetera. So what you see here are just a few things that have happened in the current year. If I'm going to say an overarching bit about this slide, is that my expectation is that enforcement of worker misclassification will continue fairly unabated. I do not expect it to be set aside. Now, this all really starts this year with California's AB5 going into effect. The test in AB5 is highly restrictive. It's the ABC test, really the most restrictive classification test for ICs in the country. I'll mention that because it'll come up in different ways later, the ABC test. So that went into effect in California. And then since then, you'll see some pre-pandemic and even some post-pandemic things on this. And New Jersey has signed a whole slate of worker misclassification laws that are set to pass. New York, if you're doing business in New York, be very cognizant of what's happening there. New York City is sort of like its own kingdom that passes its own laws, and then there's the New York governor who's already said that he gone on record saying that New York should be even tougher, if that's possible, on worker misclassification than California. Virginia is set in July for 4 new worker misclassification bills to pass, and as of last week when I was reading on this, those aren't planned to be set aside. They're going to be effective. So businesses will have to comply with whatever those will be if you're doing business in Virginia. And then you throw into it these sort of different sides of things, like the Federal CARES Act, which is a necessary action that the federal government took that provides unemployment, underlying the word employee, unemployment benefits under certain circumstances to independent contractors. Those 2 worlds you sort of never ever meet for fear of making your independent worker look like an employee, but this is where we're at right now. On April 15th, California did have an open letter go out to set aside AB5 and that really restrictive ABC test. It's very unlikely that that's going to happen. And if there's any indication that enforcement is going to continue during the pandemic, post-pandemic, you'll see that last week California, through AB5, filed a large misclassification lawsuit against Uber and Lyft. So again, the expectation is that when we're looking forward, enforcement of worker misclassification needs to still be on the radar as a real risk to businesses. All right, Jen. Further evidence that I do not expect enforcement to be set aside is money, dollars. So, one of the big reasons for enforcing worker misclassification, to finding out if workers are classified properly, being paid properly as a 1099 or a W-2, is tax gap. There are lots of advertised numbers in the millions, in the billions that you can readily find from states, state agencies, the federal government, on the amount of money that's not going into government coffers because people are misclassifying workers. So, again, as we head into a time when dollars are as important now as ever, and federal dollars important as well, state dollars, I would not expect, again, enforcement is a fairly low-hanging fruit activity for state agencies, attorneys general, and even the federal government to go and collect. Because why is it fairly? It's estimated that 63% misreports their income as an independent contractor. So there's a lot of money to be collected. So we put all this together, put it in the pot. You've got businesses that are going to increase their use of contingent workers. You've got states, even cities, that are creating new laws to be tougher, crack down on misclassification, and then you've got huge tax gaps. You put all that together, enforcement, again, should be right there on the radar for businesses that are going to go forward to use these contingent workers that really do need to be used as part of their business plans post-pandemic.
Yeah, it is really, truly the perfect storm, isn't it?
I'd say. So one thing to consider here is, I mentioned that we've had the same two working classifications since the New Deal. Very long time, a lot of changes have happened. But one thing that hasn't happened is a third class of worker under United States law. We've seen this happen in different ways to different extents in other countries. It can be done some ways better than others. But one thing to consider, certainly, if you think about the CARES Act having already sort of crossed that line, so to speak, of providing employee-type benefits to non-employees, the time could be ripe coming out of this pandemic to consider at some point a third class of worker. This worker would more match the reality of the past, maybe 2 decades of work engagements. And it will also provide perhaps some clarity to companies that look to comply but really don't know how to meet these very stringent tests. What we've seen too is when you've got new tests like the ABC test being applied to old working structures like merely W-2 and 1099, it creates a whole world of unintended consequences that the consideration of a third class of U.S. worker, might alleviate. So with changing times, we might want to be looking to the future. And one thing I'd say is, if we're thinking about it from just a business level, these are the kind of things you want to consider in utilizing contingent workers, going forward. What we're reading in some of the reports is that, both employees and contingent workers, they want to engage with forward-thinking companies, companies that are looking out for the health, the mental health, the well-being, the safety of their workforce, during this pandemic and coming out of this pandemic. So my advice to businesses is, you're seeing some of the writing on the wall with some of the things that are happening with the CARES Act, and also what workers are going to be looking for. And so you might want to consider policies that you wouldn't consider, before, such as, facilitating benefits, offerings to maybe contingent workers. In other words, your company doesn't provide them, but maybe they provide information on how a freelancer can get health insurance. So a little bit of different optics. And I did write a blog on that, but I didn't want to shamelessly self-promote Jen, my own blog.
I'll take care of that for you, Rob.
I appreciate that. Briefly here, so what if we're to look back a few months from now, what might we see, having happened? I think it's really from the two sides, business side and the worker side. If you look at the business side, well, businesses have had to create these lean operating models based on what's happened to cut costs during the pandemic. Long it'll take for business to recover, and we don't really know what that's going to look like. But those are the thoughts you want to give to coming out of this is, well, what should my new normal look like? We know there's going to be one. What should it look like? And how can, my company, the company I'm advising, maintain or come out of this with a competitive advantage as related to other companies? The length of the recession after this, the new normal, these are unknowns. We do expect, as Jen said, just speaking to 3 clients, there's going to be a hesitancy to hire full-time employees, but you still have work to get done. So that's where your contingents come in. That said, what I'd add there is that even the benefits that full-time employment have, those are the kind of things that we may see slight shifts in. In other words, for example, New York City has passed laws that provide employee-type benefits directly to freelancers. Well, is that going to be the kind of thing that spreads? And should your company be cognizant of that? Definitely trying to attract that talent, but attract it in new ways coming out of this pandemic. On the worker side, a lot of them got a taste of flexible environment and working remotely. We've talked to a lot of people, and what we're hearing from workers is, even when offices open, are you going to force me to come back? Will we be forcing people to come back? So there's almost sort of an optics angle to this too. And how are you treating your workers? Will you let them continue to work sort of flexibly from home? And if they are to come back to the office, what safeguards are you making so that they feel comfortable coming back? So things like close contact and all that. And so that's a few of the things there.
Yeah, I know in our organization, we're having our company, create interesting looking arrows so that our hallways can be one way. And, we've had to redo our seating charts so that we have the 6 foot distance and whatnot. So lots of things going on with reopening offices that can't, be virtualized 100%. So that said, another statistic that I saw last week, I think it came out of SIA, 32% of companies are replacing their full-time workers that are leaving with contingent workers. So again, lots of information and data that says, the gig economy is growing. You've got the legislation that's changing, but what do you do about it, right? How do I prep for the new normal? And, we really believe that you need to be able to engage these workers risk-free and safely, so that you can still get your projects done, so that you can still get your work done. And sometimes it may be so that you can retain the knowledge and the workers that you had prior to the pandemic. So looking at, creating a compliance program where you can engage these folks safely, operationalizing a smart compliance. And I would tell you that if you're going to do this, my absolute #1 best practice in building a compliance program is ensuring that you have strong executive leader sponsorship. Because those are the folks that are going to help you get past this. Folks in legal, folks in the operations, obviously anybody on the executive team that can buy into this idea and understand that you need to engage this talent in a different way. And in order to win the war for talent, you're going to have to build a compliance program so that you can bring these independent contractors and these gig workers on, because in the new norm, that's how much of the work is going to get done. So engaging with your organization to help you categorize your workers appropriately is very important. Understand and audit your own data. Who do you have working? How are they engaged today? And how are they classified today? Analyzing your spend, being certain that you don't have rogue or at-risk spend sitting and existing within your contingent labor program, or if you do, identifying that and figuring out, how to classify that properly. You may want to partner with a specialist who understands IC compliance and labor laws, and perform an audit prior to this so that you understand what your risk assessment looks like. Making sure that the method you're using to engage ICs takes into account any new legislation. Whether you're sitting in Virginia or California or New York or you're sitting in, Wisconsin or Michigan. Both Wisconsin and Michigan have recently put out notifications that they're building task forces to go after employee misclassification. I'm sure that COVID has changed the government structure just a little bit, and their day-to-day responsibilities are a little different than this. But when things get a little bit back to normal, I'm sure that, as Rob said earlier, that the states at the state level are going to be looking at misclassification to help build their revenue stream again. And then lastly, develop an actionable plan that your team and that your executive team can agree upon, implement, and stick to. Because it's important that once you open the doors, you're ensuring that all the folks that you engage as an IC come in appropriately and compliantly.
Yeah, that's right, Jen. And do engage ICs. I think that's something that we're to take from this here is that your businesses that you're advising. We're in the business of risk mitigation. But one of the risks that you never walk away from is using ICs. It could be risky if you don't have a plan, if you don't know what they look like. But if you do, and that's what this slide gets to, you're better suited to move forward in using ICs. So what are some of the telltale signs? I mean, there's a whole lot of signs of what an independent contractor is, but some general ones. You're paying them on a 1099 versus paying them on a W-2. So W-2, you're taking those withholdings out. 1099, it's incumbent on the independent worker to pay those withholdings to the state and the Fed. They typically work as an individual or self-employed or a really small business, not a really large business where misclassification doesn't really come into play. Short-term or finite projects, one thing is you want somebody who's contingent to come in, to come out. Maybe they come back again, but they're not just sort of always on, like an employee would be. Typically, you want to pay them on milestones or benchmarks as opposed to hourly. Hourly is the telltale sign of an employee, for better or for worse. That's just how it is under the two classifications. So milestone benchmarks, in other words, I'm paying you to deliver X. When you deliver X, that's when you get paid. You like to couple and engage with independent contractors who have multiple clients. You don't want to look like their only client because then you might end up looking like their employer. Subject matter experts. You like to get someone who brings a skill set that you don't have internally amongst your employees. It's another good thing. And then typically uses their own equipment. Well, what that is you just don't want an independent contractor who comes, uses all your equipment. In some cases, maybe buys equipment for your project and then can take that equipment with them to use amongst their client base. Those are some of the characteristics to keep cognizant of. All right. And we went a little bit, I think know this. We've talked about the need to do it. We talked about how companies will do it, but it's always a good idea to do it. And some of the good reasons, provides quick access to specialized skill sets, reduces that cost of full-time employment overhead. Usually an independent contractor is going to be 30% cheaper overall than an employee would. So you can bring people on, scale it, kind of freely and quickly, and then move on. So you could bring on, the ability to kind of scale, I guess, back and forth would be really what you're looking for. And also just keep in mind that competitor organizations like yours, they're looking for the same talent. So I guess that's why I go back to, you want to be an attractive, not really on here, but you want to be that attractive engagement party of choice. So always be thinking about how can we be on the cutting edge or ahead of the curve on that. So those are some of the reasons. So certainly there's a whole lot of reasons to use flexible talent.
Great. So in summary, attracting and leveraging great talent is in the new norm. Progressive companies must take the lead and create pathways to prepare for post-COVID workforce strategies. We believe that the gig is here. It's going to grow. We believe that being able to engage them safely, compliantly, and risk-free is key for you in the future. And we believe that now may be the time to develop and build solutions that take into account all types of workers. As my friend Michael Schultz at Acclaimant says, the trend is your friend. Pay attention to it. So, Bill.
Thank you, Jen. Thank you, Rob. Let's open it up to questions right now. As a reminder, you can ask a question by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of the webinar window. And we do have one question right now. It sounds like even with COVID-19, states and the federal government won't necessarily ease up on 1099 enforcement moving forward. Would love to hear your thoughts.
Right. Yeah. So if I heard the question correctly, it sounds like the enforcement from state and fed is not going to sort of abate. Is that right? Did I hear that right?
Correct.
Yes.
Okay. Correct. Great. Thanks. Yeah. Yeah, that's right. So if I'm reading the tea leaves, and of course this is, as we all say, an unprecedented situation, so a little bit harder to look into that crystal ball. But you just have not been coming across and not been seeing that worker misclassification is going to be sort of a thing of the past or just a thing to address in the future. So I do expect that's there. I mean, the advice I'm giving to companies is the same as I gave before when it comes to classifying properly, is that stay abreast of any changes. So be really kind of flexible and agile. If you hear something get set aside, like for instance, AB5 in California, great. No longer do we need to comply with the ABC test. Now we need to comply with the Borrello test, which was there for the previous 3 decades. So be really flexible. Keep your ear to the pavement, so to speak. But no, the perception that I'm getting is enforcement is not going to really go away.
And I think that, again, when California, legally sued, Uber and Lyft last week, that's an example of not lifting, their regulations. Virginia, that came out literally after March 15th, when everybody got, virtualized, if you will, and sent home, they came out with those 3 bills in the first week, I think it was April, and they're going into play in July. So totally agree that states are not going to let up.
Great. We've got another question. My company doesn't use independent contractors regularly. If this is the new trend, what is the single biggest risk an employer has in using independent contractors, and how do we steer clear?
Yeah, your single biggest risk is going to be misclassification, and that remains the same. How you steer clear of that? You paper it up. Basically, you have to have some sort of vetting regime that makes sure that the way you're paying them is the way they should be paid under the law. And so, a few things you would do would be using things like an independent contractor agreement. There's your paper that says you're not an employee, that says some of those signs of an independent contractor kind of written and baked into there. And then you make sure those practices reflect what's on paper. So by being able to document, that your engagement is correct, that's how you would defend against an audit. What we're actually advising clients to right now is another thing that's popped up on the radar with the CARES Act is, well, what happens if my company gets an unemployment claim that my HR department has to fill out, but it's an unemployment claim for an independent contractor? Well, we're advising on that, how to do that too, because in many states' cases, they have not updated their paperwork to allow for whoever's making that claim to say I'm self-employed. So they're filling it out as an employee. Well, is my company at risk if we fill this paperwork out as an employee and then later on that kicks an audit? So we're papering that up too. In other words, companies should be sending letters back to make it clear that while they're completing this, this paperwork, this person is self-employed and not an employee. So that's what I mean by make sure you can document whatever your engagement is.
All right, great. Another question. You highlighted recent legislation at the state level for worker classification. Will more states follow, or even a federal initiative, especially after the CARES Act?
Right. So there is, I've mentioned a few other states there, Washington State, and Pennsylvania, that have that restrictive ABC test right now on the table. At the Fed level, there is the PRO Act, Protecting Rights, Right to Organize Act. That did pass the assembly. It's not expected to. That would codify the ABC test as part of it. It passed the assembly, not expected to pass the Senate. Republican-controlled Senate will probably shoot it down. In my experience of studying federal legislation on independent contractors, once every 3 to 5 years, a federal one law to rule them all, so to speak, comes out, and it never passes. This one is not expected to pass either.
Okay, one more question. I have concerns about things I'm seeing in my organization related to appropriate worker classification. Any advice on how to navigate through this?
Sure. So my first concern would be, definitely engage executives, right? Talk with legal, talk with the change makers and share with them your concerns. Folks that sit in legal would probably have the same concerns if you bring something like that up to them. But definitely engage the right legal folks and the right executives, share the concerns and share the ideas that we shared with you about building a compliance program.
Great. Oh, one more question came in. Hopefully everybody's got time. Would you agree with the proposition that to be safe, a company should only contract with independent contractors who have a business status, such as an LLC or S corporation, as opposed to just an undocumented status?
Well, no, I wouldn't wholeheartedly agree. Although certainly the showing of a corporate form could work in your favor. We have many sole proprietors. In other words, they don't have any corporate form. They do business under, their social security number that are nonetheless, fully qualified ICs because they meet all those others. They have other clients. They have a business set up. Likewise, companies have gotten into LLCs could be set up so easily these days. I could probably set one up in the 5 minutes remaining and then come back and tell you I've got one. So lots of times they're looked at under certain scenarios as attempts to circumvent the law. So I've set myself up as an LLC, so I look like an IC, but guess what? I'm not. I don't comply with any sort of corporate regulation, so really not. So no, I don't think. Well, that's one step in your favor. It can be looked at. It can be used just to get around the laws too.
Great. And another question just came in. With the legislation tightening everywhere, is the protection, for example, indemnifications, a third-party compliance firm can offer likely to decrease?
I think I heard most of that. I think it's speaking to would indemnifications offered by third parties decrease. That's a tough one to really answer. I think if you're a business that offers that kind of indemnification, as a third party specialist, you'd be loath now, and it'd probably be really hard to negotiate that out of your contracts. I think if you remove that from your engagement contracts, savvy other side, or even a not so savvy other side, is going to push to have indemnification put back in. So I don't think that changes. I think it puts the onus more in a contract on making sure to accurately reflect the relationships. So maybe it'll tighten down on what specifically is being indemnified for, but would indemnification, be removed as a whole or big chunks of it? No, I don't think so.
All right. Well, thank you, Jen, and thank you, Rob, and thanks to everybody who attended. We hope that you found today's webinar insightful and educational. As a reminder, we'll be providing a recorded version of this webinar along with a downloaded version of the presentation on our website, and an email will be sent to you with a link to access this. Thanks again, and I hope you have a good rest of your day.